In the harsh winter of 1938, as Franco's troops advanced through the mountainous region of Asturias, Spain, American war correspondent Thomas McKinnon uncovered a secret buried deep in a remote valley near the village of Pays, an encounter that would torment him for the rest of his life. Hidden away for decades, the surviving locals spoke in hushed tones about a cursed bloodline. The Calderón family centered around three sisters, Elena, Magdalena, and Esperanza, who not only lived under one roof, but shared a single husband, in what experts would later identify as the most genetically isolated family in modern European history. McKinnon's harrowing report, sealed in U.S. State Department archives for over 80 years, remains classified alongside disturbing testimonies too unsettling for public release. What transpired in that isolated corner of Asturias between 1895 and 1938 defies conventional understanding of family obsession and the terrifying lengths people will go to preserve what they believe is pure blood. If you're drawn to unsettling historical mysteries with unexpected ties to American history, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. We dig up chilling, long-forgotten stories from around the globe. Drop a comment to let us know where you're tuning in from, especially if your roots trace back to Spain or Europe. You might recognize traces of the old world secrets we're about to unravel. The eastern mountains of Asturias had always been a place the outside world forgot, and even as Spain descended into civil war from 1936 to 1939, the high valleys near the Picos de Europa remained untouched by modern conflict. In the secluded hamlet of Pang, the Calderón family had lived for nearly 300 years, arriving from the Basque region in the 1640s as herders and masons. By 1895, only Don Aurelio Calderón and his three daughters, Elena, 22, Magdalena, 20, and Esperanza, 18, remained, after the death of their mother Concepcion during childbirth. Aurelio raised the girls in complete isolation from the few scattered families in the valley. The nearest town, Cangas de Onís, was a full day's journey away by mule over dangerous mountain paths, often impassable in winter. Aurelio was consumed by an obsession he called la pureza de sangre, the purity of blood. He spent years poring over ancestral records, tracing the Calderón name through centuries of marriages, carefully kept free of what he saw as contamination. No Moorish unions, no converso ties, and no mixing with the local peasantry he deemed inferior. But with no male heir, he faced an unbearable dilemma. Allow his daughters to marry outsiders and dilute what he believed was sacred blood, or let the family line die with him. Then a third unthinkable option began to form in his increasingly disturbed mind during the long, isolating winters. Raised to believe they were nobility descended from Gothic kings, the Calderón sisters lived under the weight of their father's myths. Elena, sharp-eyed and loyal, became his closest confidant in genealogical matters. Magdalena, more gentle and curious, was warned that questioning their world was a moral failing. Esperanza, born with a limp that Aurelio interpreted as a mark of noble blood, was treated as a living emblem of their so-called divine lineage. Their isolation warped them. By the mid-1890s, they spoke in a strange hybrid of archaic Castilian-Asturian dialect and even traces of medieval Latin. They wore clothes from centuries past, sewn from patterns handed down for generations. And their home existed in a time capsule that blurred the line between tradition and madness. Most disturbing of all, the boundary between familial devotion and something far darker had begun to erode. That winter, Aurelio made a decision, one born from obsession, fear, and pride, that would echo across time and eventually reach a young American journalist whose life would never be the same. One frigid evening in 1895, Aurelio Calderón gathered his daughters in the main room of their stone farmhouse and unveiled what he called a sacred duty. a plan to preserve the family bloodline by having them all marry a man named Rodrigo Calderón, a supposed distant cousin from a village near Santander. Rodrigo, he assured them, came from untainted Calderón stock with lineage tracing back to a shared noble ancestor. What he didn't reveal was the grotesque truth Rodrigo was not a cousin at all, but Aurelio's own son by his deceased sister Carmen, making him the sister's half-brother. The lie was meticulously supported by forged documents. Aurelio had spent months preparing, all in service of his deranged belief that this incestuous arrangement would not only preserve but purify the bloodline, concentrating it to perfection. The plan was as cold as it was calculated. Each sister would rotate as Rodrigo's primary wife on a monthly basis, while the others acted as assistants, and any children would be raised communally with their specific parentage deliberately hidden. Elena, ever devoted, agreed without hesitation. Magdalena voiced concern, but was shut down with talk of divine providence and family honor. Only young Esperanza saw the full horror, but was dismissed as naive. Rodrigo arrived in November, just before the mountain passes closed for the winter, a hollow-eyed, weather-worn man of 35 who seemed to understand his purpose far too well. As snow sealed off the valley, the family's isolation became total, and Aurelio's plan began to unfold with disturbing precision. Rodrigo was intense and oddly familiar, his mannerisms and knowledge of the valley's past betraying a deeper connection than anyone had admitted. Elena's month as his wife triggered a strange transformation. She became obsessed with genealogy, crafting detailed family trees and whispering with Rodrigo in secret. But unease spread quickly. Rodrigo's stories of his youth contradicted Aurelio's narrative, and his uncanny resemblance to the Calderón patriarch, his gray eyes, cleft chin, and narrow nose, did not go unnoticed. Magdalena, next in the rotation, began pressing for the truth, but was met with fury from Aurelio so intense it only deepened her suspicion. The final blow came in February 1897, during a blizzard that trapped the family indoors for days, when Esperanza discovered a hidden cache of letters beneath her father's mattress. They were from Carmen, Aurelio's sister, who had died in childbirth in 1862 after bearing an illegitimate son. Though the father's identity was never publicly acknowledged, the dates and tone of the letters made it clear Aurelio was both Rodrigo's father and uncle. Sent away after birth to live with distant relatives, Rodrigo grew up unaware of his true origin. The letters also revealed that Aurelio had been secretly corresponding with him for over 5 years, carefully crafting a false narrative while gradually luring him into the twisted role of groom. To 3 unsuspecting sisters, his own half-sisters, under the guise of family duty and divine legacy. Aurelio had convinced Rodrigo he was a distant cousin with a duty to help preserve the Calderón bloodline, never revealing that this so-called duty involved impregnating his own half-sisters. The truth once uncovered by Esperanza shattered her. That same night, she confronted her father, accusing him of orchestrating not just incest, but a form of long-planned generational abuse. Aurelio's response was chilling in its calmness. He dismissed conventional morality as irrelevant for bloodlines, as ancient and untainted as theirs. The taboos of common people, he argued, didn't apply to the Calderóns, whose lineage he claimed demanded a higher form of duty, what outsiders called incest or abuse. He reframed as sacred genetic refinement. In his warped view, the resulting children would be intellectual, spiritual, and physical paragons, the divine product of purified ancestry. Esperanza's horror deepened as she realized that escape was impossible. The winter locked them in, and the outside world was a mystery she had never touched. When spring came, she had nowhere to run, no resources, no allies. And now both Elena and Magdalena were showing signs of pregnancy forever, binding them to Aurelio's twisted vision. Faced with helplessness, Esperanza chose to stay, but not to comply. She began to record everything documenting daily life, her sister's pregnancies, and the disturbing transformation of the next generation. The first children were born in autumn 1897. Elena gave birth to twins, Alonso and Kumpchen, and Magdalena delivered a daughter named Carmen after the aunt whose tragic existence had been erased. With no access to medical care, Aurelio delivered them himself, and from the beginning, the children bore signs that the experiment had worked or failed in ways no one had imagined. All three shared the Calderón's signature gray eyes. But physical deformities soon emerged. Alonso's underbite distorted his speech. Kumpchen had partially webbed fingers, and Carmen, though physically normal, was nearly deaf, forcing the family to invent a system of hand signals. More unsettling than their bodies, however, were their minds. By the age of 3, they were obsessed with lineage, asked probing questions about parentage, and showed no interest in play, instead spending hours examining the genealogical charts that wallpapered the house. They spoke in hushed tones about bloodlines, carried themselves with eerie self-awareness, and instinctively kept the family's secrets. As the years passed, the horror deepened. By 1905, the sisters had given birth to 8 children in total, with Rodrigo continuing his rotation among them. The boundaries between relationships became increasingly blurred, and the older children began participating in conversations about genetic pairings and blood purity as if it were a family board game passed down through generations. The idea of specific parentage was now deliberately vague, the truth swallowed by Aurelio's doctrine of collective purity. The outside world, already distant, became irrelevant. The children received no formal education, no medical attention, and no socialization beyond the household. They learned reading and writing from family records, practiced math by calculating bloodline combinations, and absorbed a worldview entirely shaped by their grandfather's lectures on genetic superiority. The Calderón farmhouse, sealed off by snow and ideology, had become a closed-loop world where the past devoured the future, and every life born inside its stone walls was just another thread in a tapestry woven from obsession, isolation, and inherited delusion. As the 20th century unfolded, Aurelio's declining health brought an urgent focus to establishing the second generation of his twisted breeding program. Despite his physical deformities, Alfonso was being groomed as the next patriarch, while his sisters and cousins were evaluated with clinical precision, using genetic charts to forecast ideal offspring combinations. The most chilling aspect of this arrangement was the complete acceptance by the children who had been conditioned to believe that normal families were corrupt, and that their own system of rotational incest was a superior form of human society. By the time Alfonso reached puberty in 1910, he expressed open eagerness to take on his sacred role, viewing future relationships with his sisters and cousins as a divine obligation. Watching this unfold, Esperanza knew she could no longer save herself. Too much had been done, and she was part of the history, but she could still hope to save the younger children. Her detailed journals had become a meticulous archive, documenting 3 generations of incest, genetic manipulation, and psychological reprogramming, which she hoped would one day serve as evidence to end the nightmare. But outside intervention grew more unlikely as Spain descended into unrest. Government oversight in rural regions collapsed in the late 1910s, and the looming civil war created the perfect cover for the Calderón family's unchecked atrocities. By 1920, the second generation had begun reproducing. Alfonso fathered children with both his sister Kumpchen and cousin Carmen, and the resulting offspring showed even more pronounced deformities and developmental disorders. Instead of recognizing the failure, Aurelio, now in his 70s, but still mentally sharp, framed these tragedies as necessary trials in the quest for genetic purification, claiming the weak were God's way of separating the flawed from the chosen. The family developed elaborate religious justifications for high infant mortality. believing children who died early had fulfilled their purpose, and those who survived were divine vessels. By the mid-1920s, nearly 30 individuals lived on the expanded Calderón compound, all descended from the original sisters and Rodrigo, forming a closed, self-sustaining community governed by strict genetic doctrine. Their society had its own rules, its own values, and an internal logic that no longer resembled any part of the outside world. When Aurelio died in 1930 at 85, the family's structure shifted again. Leadership passed to Alonso, now 33, whose physical decline, tremors, malformed teeth, early balding, mirrored his cognitive deterioration, leaving him incapable of managing the complex genealogical strategies his grandfather once commanded. Control passed instead to Compton, who had inherited Aurelio's fanaticism and intelligence. Under her rule, the family's breeding practices became even more regimented. She introduced precise mating schedules based on detailed records of physical and mental traits and conducted regular genetic evaluations of all family members to identify the strongest combinations. The third generation, now over 20 children, bore the full weight of 40 years of inbreeding. Physical deformities like cleft palates, club feet, and skeletal abnormalities were so frequent that the family developed their own rudimentary care systems, while cognitive disabilities ranged from mild to severe. Yet none of this shook their belief in the mission. The children had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that incest carried no stigma. Sibling, cousin, even uncle-niece relationships were discussed with clinical detachment. They analyzed one another's genetics with dispassionate interest, spoke of bloodline duty with excitement, and viewed themselves not as victims, but as chosen participants in a sacred quest. Their isolation had evolved into a cultural divergence so profound that by the 1930s, the Calderons were no longer merely a family. They were a society unto themselves, one engineered from obsession, fed by secrecy, and perpetuated by a belief system that had erased the boundaries of morality, identity, and even reality. By the 1930s, the Calderón family had become a civilization. Apart, cut off not just geographically, but culturally, linguistically, and spiritually from the rest of Spain. Their dialect had mutated into a cryptic fusion of archaic Spanish religious symbolism and genetic terminology incomprehensible to outsiders. Their clothing, handmade from 1890s-era patterns, and their worldview frozen in the ideals of their founding patriarch, made them walking relics in a country charging toward modernity. At 53, prematurely aged and weighed down by decades of complicity, Esperanza made a final decision that would change everything. She had spent years documenting the family's systematic breeding practices in hidden journals, but now understood that documentation meant nothing unless it reached the outside world. Her plan was desperate and clever. She began placing coded messages in places where the occasional hunter-surveyor or trader might stumble upon them. Written in standard Spanish and designed to sound like anthropological invitations, they described a secluded community preserving ancient Iberian traditions and hinted at potential scholarly interest, even offering directions to the compound for those respectful enough to approach. It was a plea for salvation wrapped in academic curiosity. But the country was falling apart faster than her strategy could unfold. The Second Republic, founded in 1931, quickly descended into chaos, and by the mid-1930s, the brutal Spanish Civil War rendered government oversight in rural regions non-existent. In eastern Asturias, where the Calderons lived, law enforcement collapsed entirely, replaced by militias, deserters, and outlaws who roamed the mountains unchecked. For the Calderons, the war was paradoxical. It removed the threat of discovery, but introduced dangerous outsiders into their isolated realm. Rather than seeing this as a chance to break free, the family interpreted the war as proof of their ideological superiority. The violence of the outside world, they believed, confirmed the righteousness of their insular society, a utopia built on genetic excellence and spiritual order. Those who questioned this belief were subjected to re-education, and children who expressed a desire to leave were confined until they displayed loyalty. Outsiders who stumbled upon the valley were either absorbed into the breeding program or quietly eliminated. Then in the winter of 1937 to 1938, fate caught up with them. As Franco's forces swept across northern Spain, government troops began scouring remote valleys for Republican rebels, arms caches, and political fugitives. In December 1937, a Guardia Civil patrol led by Sergeant Miguel Renteria found one of Esperanza's messages tucked inside the ruins of a forgotten shepherd's hut. It described a traditional mountain community that had maintained pure bloodlines and invited respectful contact. Renteria, initially skeptical, reconsidered when the note's detailed geographic references suggested the area could also shelter Republican resistance. In January 1938, he led a detachment into Pine Valley, unwittingly stepping into a secret that had been festering for over 4 decades. What they found shocked even seasoned soldiers, a cluster of stone houses seemingly untouched by time, occupied by people in outdated clothing, speaking a bizarre dialect and operating under an internal order that felt medieval and alien. As they dug deeper, what emerged was a horror no war had prepared them for. Inside the main farmhouse, every wall was covered in meticulous genealogical charts tracing generations of calculated incest. Birth records confirmed breeding cycles between siblings, cousins, uncles, and aunts, all orchestrated by Aurelio and later by Compton. There were no secrets here, only doctrine. The family spoke proudly of their practices, describing them as sacred duties, not shameful acts. To the Guardia Civil, it was not just a hidden community, but a closed genetic cult frozen in time and ideology. And in that moment, Sergeant Renteria realized they hadn't stumbled on a rebel stronghold, but something far more disturbing, a living monument to obsession, isolation, and the terrifying power of belief unchecked by the outside world. Sergeant Miguel Renteria, a hardened military man who had witnessed the worst atrocities of Spain's brutal civil war, found himself confronted by something beyond war crimes. A multi-generational breeding program executed with scientific precision and religious zeal. This wasn't rural abuse born of ignorance, but a self-sustaining, systematically orchestrated eugenic society. What could have ended with a quiet arrest and institutional custody took a dramatically different course due to the presence of an unexpected figure, Thomas McKinnon, a 28-year-old American war correspondent embedded with the Guardia Civil Patrol to document the war's impact on rural Spain. McKinnon, curious about how isolated communities were adapting to the chaos, had no idea he was about to uncover one of the most horrifying sociological cases in modern European history. His outsider status, journalistic training, and lack of political allegiance allowed him to engage with the Calderón family from a uniquely detached and analytical perspective. Unlike the Spanish authorities, who viewed the family through a lens of national shame and legal complication, McKinnon saw a rare and terrifying opportunity to document a complete sociogenetic experiment in real time. He recognized instantly that the family was not just isolated, they were the result of a closed-loop system of inbreeding maintained over 40 years in deliberate pursuit of genetic purity. Yet given the war-torn political climate, there was no appetite for scandal. Franco's regime, focused on suppressing opposition and consolidating power, had no interest in broadcasting the discovery of a cult-like family engaged in incestuous reproduction in the northern mountains. Thus, Renteria and McKinnon devised a covert plan. The Calderón children would be quietly placed in institutions for medical care and re-education, while the adults would face charges under the radar. In return for ensuring the children's welfare, McKinnon agreed to withhold publication of his findings until the government completed its investigation. But Spain's unstable post-war bureaucracy buried the case, and what was meant to be a temporary silence stretched into permanent obscurity. The full horror of what McKinnon witnessed during the week-long February 1938 investigation would remain locked in sealed archives for decades. Accompanied by discreet Spanish medical authorities, McKinnon meticulously recorded evidence of the family's intergenerational incest, genetic degeneration, and psychological conditioning. The revelations were staggering. Carlos Mendizabal, a geneticist from the University of Salamanca, sworn to secrecy, confirmed that the Calderón bloodline displayed levels of homozygosity and isolation unprecedented in scientific literature. The genetic fallout was visible everywhere. Nearly every family member bore physical deformities ranging from malformed teeth and misaligned skeletal structures to congenital deafness and organ malformations. Infant mortality exceeded 60%, mostly due to genetic defects. Yet even more disturbing than the physical toll was the mental landscape of the survivors. The children and young adults had been raised to view each other, not as brothers, sisters, or cousins, but as potential breeding matches stripped of emotional connections and bound only by genetic calculus. They spoke in a language that fused genetics with theology. And under the leadership of Comshin, now the de facto matriarch, their lives were governed by rigid breeding schedules, performance rankings, and calculated assessments of reproductive value. She maintained exhaustive records, scoring each family member's contributions to genetic progress like a bureaucrat managing livestock. McKinnon's interviews revealed a society that had replaced love, individuality, and morality with cold-blooded heredity and spiritual dogma. And yet, behind Comshin's meticulous control and the children's eerie composure, he sensed a deep, unnamed sadness, generations born into purpose, but robbed of personhood, created not to live, but to serve a twisted ideal of perfection. The Calderón children, ranging from infants to young adults, displayed levels of indoctrination that defied belief. They spoke openly and eagerly about their roles in future breeding schedules, assessing their siblings and cousins as genetic assets rather than family, and described participation in the program as a sacred calling. But the most devastating discovery came with the unearthing of Esperanza's hidden journals, meticulously detailed records chronicling the family's descent over 4 decades. These writings revealed not only every breeding decision and genetic outcome, but also the psychological methods used to enforce obedience and suppress rebellion. Several family members had attempted escape over the years, but all had been tracked, punished, and either reconditioned through brutal correctional processes or permanently silenced. The family had engineered an intricate system of behavioral control. No one could travel alone. Children underwent loyalty testing, and a culture of constant mutual surveillance ensured that dissent was swiftly reported and crushed. These practices were underpinned by a warped theology, a fusion of distorted Catholic doctrine and pseudo-scientific eugenics, which taught that the Calderóns were chosen to purify humanity itself, and that betrayal meant both eternal damnation and the unraveling of the divine mission. This belief system rendered rebellion psychologically impossible for those raised inside it. Further investigations revealed just how deeply the family had withdrawn from normal civilization. They had created a currency based on genetic value, organized their calendar around breeding cycles, and operated under their own internal laws, with Comshin presiding as judge, jury, and executioner. Yet even more terrifying was the family's plan for expansion. Far from remaining insular, the leadership had developed strategies to absorb new genetic material from other isolated families in the region. Esperanza's journals described carefully orchestrated recruitment campaigns that targeted vulnerable households suffering from death poverty or political instability. These families were offered aid and marital alliances, unaware they were being lured into a system of ritualized incest and genetic slavery. At least 6 recruits had already been integrated over the past decade, subjected to isolation, indoctrination, and eventual absorption into the breeding program. Those who resisted faced escalating coercion. If they continued to refuse, they vanished, recorded in Esperanza's notes with sterile euphemisms like returned to God or departed for fortune. Evidence of their fates was buried literally in a forest graveyard surrounding the compound, where investigators uncovered at least 20 unmarked graves, victims of failed integration or genetic defects quietly disposed of to maintain the illusion of perfection. But perhaps the most chilling revelation came when McKinnon uncovered evidence that some local authorities had long been aware of the family's activities. Reports from priests and rumors from villagers had surfaced over the years, but were dismissed as folklore. Even missing persons cases had been attributed to wartime chaos rather than prompting investigation. This systemic neglect, born of political instability and indifference, had allowed the Calderons to operate unchecked for over 40 years. Their discovery in 1938 was not the result of any deliberate investigation, but a coincidence, an accident of war that finally pierced their isolation. For McKinnon, the case revealed not merely a tragedy of family pathology, but a national failure, a chilling testament to what can thrive in forgotten corners when society looks away. The dismantling of the Calderon compound in March 1938 required a secretive, tightly controlled operation involving doctors, social workers, and armed guards sworn to silence. What had been discovered was too dangerous, too unthinkable to ever be made public. And so, just as the family had been buried in obscurity for decades, the truth of their existence was buried again, this time under the seal of classified archives and official silence. In the chaotic aftermath of Spain's civil war, overwhelmed by reconstruction and desperate to protect the image of Franco's new regime, Spanish authorities moved swiftly and quietly to dismantle the Calderón compound with as little public attention as possible. Thomas McKinnon watched as 43 individuals, most of whom had never known any life beyond the compound walls, were removed and distributed to institutions across northern Spain. The youngest, those under 10, were placed in Catholic orphanages, where efforts were made to reverse the psychological damage of their indoctrination and provide a foundation for normal development. Older children and young adults were sent to specialized facilities that combined medical treatment for genetic deformities with intense rehabilitation to prepare them, if possible, for integration into society. The adults, however, faced a darker reckoning. Conoption and other leaders of the breeding program were tried in secret courts on charges ranging from incest and child abuse to murder, but their trials were sealed from public view. Some received lengthy sentences, though many died within years, due to deteriorating health and the collapse of the ideological structure that had defined their existence. Esperanza, whose exhaustive journals had enabled the investigation, was spared prosecution in exchange for her cooperation. Though complicit, her detailed documentation became a rare and invaluable resource. Under the guidance of Dr. Mendy Zabal, she spent her remaining years working with researchers, studying the effects of generational inbreeding isolation and psychological control. The compound itself was cataloged in painstaking detail, then destroyed. McKinnon photographed every room, preserved every chart, and buried the physical evidence in sealed Spanish archives. The genealogical records, once proudly displayed across the compound, were transcribed before being burned, preserving the genetic lineage that had become a monument to obsession. In the surrounding woods, investigators uncovered 23 unmarked graves. Infants and adults alike, their remains silently attesting to 4 decades of concealed brutality. Some had died from congenital defects, others had been murdered for resisting or attempting escape. Each skeleton told a story of quiet violence necessary, according to the family, to preserve their sacred purity. For McKinnon, the discovery marked the beginning of a professional and personal nightmare. His original agreement to withhold publication seemed practical. But as years passed with no sign of disclosure, he realized the truth would be buried forever. The Franco regime, committed to the illusion of moral authority, refused to allow the scandal to surface. Every attempt McKinnon made to publish domestically or abroad was blocked by political pressure or editorial disbelief. Editors demanded proof that no government agency would provide. Defeated, McKinnon submitted his entire collection to the U.S. State Department in 1940, sealing thousands of pages of testimony photographs and genealogical charts in the hope that someone someday would unearth the truth. As for the survivors, their fates varied tragically. Children removed before the age of 5 often adjusted well, many adopted by unsuspecting families and raised without the stigma of their origins. But the older ones, shaped by years of indoctrination and physical deformity, struggled to function outside the only society they had ever known. Some required lifelong care. Others, traumatized by exposure to a world they had been taught to fear and despise, made repeated efforts to return to the ruins of the compound, seeking familiarity in the only home they understood. At least 3 took their own lives, unable to reconcile their deeply programmed worldview with the dissonance of the outside world. Yet even amid this devastation, the Calderón case left a grim legacy. Dr. Zabal's research into their genetic data contributed to breakthroughs in understanding hereditary disorders, genetic isolation, and the warning signs of closed-group pathology. The Calderón compound had been wiped from the map, but its lessons remained about power belief and what happens when an ideology left unchallenged and unseen metastasizes into something that can consume generations. The legacy of the Calderón case extended far beyond the ruined compound and broken lives it left behind. Dr. Mendy Zabal's research, grounded in Esperanza's meticulous records, played a pivotal role in shaping screening programs aimed at identifying isolated communities vulnerable to similar cycles of systematic abuse. More broadly, the case exposed a glaring national weakness: the lack of oversight in rural regions where traditional social structures had collapsed and predatory ideologies could thrive unchecked. Though the Spanish government never publicly acknowledged the Calderón tragedy, it quietly introduced policies mandating routine social and medical evaluations in remote areas, hoping to prevent future atrocities while shielding itself from scandal. McKinnon's sealed report remained classified for over 4 decades, finally opened in the 1980s during a wave of declassifications related to the Spanish Civil War. Even then, access was restricted to qualified researchers, bound by strict confidentiality agreements designed to protect surviving family members and their descendants. For McKinnon, the experience left a permanent scar. Though he continued reporting across Europe and Latin America, colleagues noted the disappearance of the hopeful idealism that had once defined his work. In interviews late in life, he called the Calderón compound a place that revealed what we become when the scaffolding of civilization falls away. The final chapter closed in 1983 with the death of Esperanza Calderón in a quiet Madrid nursing home at the age of 96. For over 40 years, she had cooperated with scientists and discreetly guided researchers through the psychological labyrinth of her family's history. Until her death, she insisted the Calderóns had acted out of sincere, if grotesquely misguided beliefs in genetic betterment and divine purpose. Her passing marked the end of direct testimony, but not the end of the Calderón story. The journal's charts and interviews she left behind became foundational documents in the study of long-term isolation, generational abuse, and the fragile boundary between ideology and horror. Through her writing and McKinnon's silent archive, the world was granted a rare and unsettling window into how normal people, when cut off from the outside world, can reshape morality into a weapon, tradition into tyranny, and blood into doctrine. The Calderón case has since become a chilling touchstone in academic studies on family pathology, genetic counseling, and the protection of vulnerable, isolated populations. The valley where their compound once stood remains largely abandoned. Its silence broken only by the wind through pine trees and the occasional hiker who stumbles upon the moss-covered remnants of stone foundations. Local whispers still speak of a cursed bloodline. But the Spanish government maintains official silence, no public acknowledgement, no memorials, and records of the investigation remain sealed under state security and privacy laws. Yet the legacy of the Calderón sisters and their shared husband continues to echo through our understanding of how human behavior can warp under the pressures of isolation, power, and belief. Their story stands as a grim reminder that civilization is fragile, easily distorted when cut off from scrutiny, and driven by ideology masquerading as destiny. In the end, the Calderóns did not create genetic perfection. They created generations of suffering, silence, and loss. Their tale is not one of monsters in the dark, but of ordinary people who, believing in a higher purpose, surrendered to darkness in plain sight. It is a testament to how quickly morality can erode in a closed system, and how easily cruelty can disguise itself as conviction. What do you think was the full truth ever truly revealed? Could other such communities still exist hidden in the folds of forgotten landscapes, pursuing their own horrific visions of human improvement? Let us know in the comments. If this tale of buried secrets and generational horror left an impression, don't forget to subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share it with someone who's drawn to the darker corners of history. We'll see you next time as we continue to unearth the forgotten horrors that shape the world we think we know. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.